1800s, African people were in the midst of fighting for their freedom. In the mainstream press, Africans were portrayed as thieves, murderers, and everything but human beings. The overwhelming struggle for African Americans to be heard through the printed word was pertinent to the fight for their rights. In 1827, a group of free black men met in New York City to create a means to disseminate information from the black perspective. We wish to plead our own cause, they said. Too long have others spoken for us. A couple of decades later, a weekly emerged in Virginia with the same goal.
As part of the action that was going on in 1900, there were what was called benevolent societies. And they were people who got together in a club, some sort of fraternal organization, to assist other people, especially widows and children who needed help. The Knights of Gideon had a newsletter that they called the Lodge Journal, and it was their newsletter that P.B. Young was hired to, P.B. Young Sr. was hired from North Carolina, came up from Littleton, North Carolina, to be the editor of that paper. Well, in 1907, the paper went bankrupt. The Knights of Gideon went bankrupt, and their newsletter went bankrupt. So P.B. Young, at that time, was the editor, and he purchased it and turned the newsletter that had been in operation into a full-fledged newspaper.
The machinery in the printing company were huge presses, ink that had a unique smell to it, and the old-fashioned linotype machines where someone would sit there all day long with the script and the print that had to go into the newspaper or go into the printing, and they would type, and these metal pieces would come out and go on a big galley or a tray and would have spacers in it, and that big galley is what would run on the press. And the words were backwards because once it printed, it showed up forward.
It's been the Norfolk Journaling Guide, it's been the New Journaling Guide, it's been the Journaling Guide. It was the Lodge Journal when it was under the ownership of the Knights of Gideon and got its start. It's had many names, but it always had two words, journal and guide. And that's because it has seen itself as a journal, which is a written document, and a guide, which is a tool to move forward.
You also have things like the Great Migration. And when you kind of think about it like the Underground Railroad, where there were people passing this information along as kind of underground. In the black press, we have this written information being passed. You get word of jobs up in the north and pass that information down to the south. And that creates a kind of a pipeline for people to be able to go and empower themselves and make themselves better.
P.B. Young was asked by the powers that be in downtown Norfolk to be on a committee to work with establishing low-income housing. Way back then, since before we ever moved from New Jersey into Norfolk, behind some of the grocery stores or some of the department stores were little hovels, tents, homeless people of all races living together. And the city founding fathers wanted to find homes for them or make an environment so they could live healthily and out of the weather and be protected and have their children. So this is why they asked P.B. Young as the token black on the committee to be a part of the discussion to develop low-income housing.
At that time, he was called a race man. That's what the term that was used back in the 40s and 50s to define an African American man or woman whose interest and whose total commitment was to encourage a better and a higher and a more accurate way of viewing people of color. And so he led that. His legacy was that to build up through education, to build up through repudiating, in that case, fake news was not a term used at that time, but the fake news about who black people were, what black people could do, the stories about desegregation that showed that black people could do and be better than our country had provided for them to do.
So the New Journaling Guide has really been a source of information, and it's also been a good place for Black people to look to see themselves painted positively, because in a country where we were told that we were 3/5 of a human and we're treated like animals, you have that source to go back to tell you that I am human, I am worth something, and this is my story.
Most people have heard of the Tuskegee Airmen, and we know that those were the men who were the first Black men to fly military planes. Well, in each branch of the military, there was a group of men and women who broke the color barrier, who were the first to step out and to be the pioneers in that military branch. For the U.S. Navy, it was the USS Mason. Black men, for the first time, served on board as other than cooks and as people who clean other people's clothes and take care of that. They served in positions that previously had been denied to them because the military services were segregated. And it was believed that Black people didn't have the tenacity or the intelligence, in many cases, to be able to have those jobs. But it was the men of the USS Mason who proved them wrong, and it was the photojournalist from the Journaling Guide who was commissioned by the Navy to actually travel on board the maiden voyage of the USS Mason and to tell the story of the desegregation of the Navy. That is a story that I feel very close to, because it illustrates that if our reporter had not been aboard, had not been commissioned by the Navy to travel on that much of the information about the desegregation and how it happened in the Navy would not have been told. It certainly would not have been told from our perspective.
I think it was terrifying to be a reporter for the New Journaling Guide, but also empowering. But it was terrifying because you still have all these things going on. It's terrifying to even be Black in America. You have these people are lynching, and the KKK is after you, burning crosses on your front lawn. You can't go to school with the white people. You can't do things that normal human beings are doing. And even as a reporter, that doesn't separate you. If anything, it makes you kind of a target because you're being these crusaders for your race. And then you also have like the war correspondents that go abroad, and they see that, hey, I'm not being treated like this over here. I should be able to be a human being in my own home. So then they come back and they have things like the Double V campaign, which was like victory at home and victory abroad. And that caught on in the Black press like wildfire. There were people everywhere saying we need this victory at home and this victory abroad. And they wanted to be treated as human beings in their own homeland, as well as winning a victory for their country that they call home, that wasn't even treating them as citizens.
Well, the Scottsboro case was a very interesting case because we were one of two Black newspapers that were allowed to cover it. And very few people know that. But the Scottsboro case sort of to a certain degree, put the African American media on the front page because we were the first ones to report the parts of that story that were overlooked by the mainstream media, like the fact that the young men were being railroaded and they were being treated unfairly, and that the reputations of the young ladies who had reported this crime falsely was not as credible as the white media wanted the world to know. Remember, this was back in the 1930s. So, as today, back then, African American men, the credibility of them was somewhat suspect. But I think the Black newspapers were able to put a more credible and viable face on those young men who actually were innocent of the crime that was, claimed against them. It was very sensational because you had these young African American men who were accused of raping this white woman in the 1930s, and a lot of black men were hung. And a lot of people are surprised that those young men were not hung at that time down in the southern part of the United States for such a crime.
I think it's even more critical that the role of the black press today be respected and elevated, because with so much information that is available through social media, so much information that is available through forms of communication that people are turning more and more to, it's important that that information is pure, authentic, and good information.
Well, the era of Trump has been dominated by two words: fake news. But anything that is not flattering to Mr. Trump and his policies and his followers is considered fake news. So all of the journalists that I know are just doing what journalism schools have been teaching them forever: is to tell the truth, be fair, be balanced, and be accurate. And Mr. Trump's propaganda, by utilizing the term fake news, will be overshadowed and overcome eventually.
Presently at the New Journaling Guide, I'm working on a story about prison letters. I know one of the letters, an inmate was talking about how he reads the New Journaling Guide every week so he can have something to debate about. And no one would think that people in jail are debating about politics, about police brutality and things like that. But, if I were to be able to tell that story, well, when I do get a chance to tell the story for the New Journaling Guide, I'm going to give a voice to the voiceless, which are the people who are in the Norfolk City Jail.
Currently, my role in the press as a young black male, it would definitely be compared to, relay races. Once you run around, you got to pass the baton on. And at this point in time in the world, the baton is in our hands. And we got to continue to run the race. And I don't want to jump ahead of myself and say to the finish line, because there's always room for improvement. So, but as of right now, the baton's in our hand, and we have to continue to run the race.
When you say that this black man is a thug, another black publication is going to say, no, he's not a thug. This is what really happened. And now you've got, of course, all the black people listening, but now you've got the people who are teetering on both sides, like, here's this side of the story. Let me listen in and understand more about what's going on.
I think it's important to report these stories, like seeing Emmett Till, for example, because Mamie Till, when she saw her son like this, she said, I want them to see what they did to my baby. So that itself was powerful because it plays on these people's humanity.
Looking through the archives of the New Journaling Guide, I would actually see the titles of the story, and it was 3 lynched, another lynching. And the reporters actually saw and wrote about what happened. Fast forward all the way up until now, when we've got modern day lynchings: Philando Castile, Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice. I can go on. And it's so important that we continue telling their stories, because if we don't tell their stories, who else will? If we don't talk about who we are, who else will? If we don't learn about who we were, who else will take the time to teach us about where we came from and where we're going? I'm Ila Wilborn, a senior broadcast journalism student at Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University, and I'm an intern here at the New Journaling Guide.
My name is Daja E. I'm a journalism student at Howard University, and I'm here as an intern with the New Journaling Guide.
My name is Natron Maxwell. I'm a senior mass communications major at Claflin University, and I'm an intern at the New Journaling Guide.